lunar mission Chandrayaan-3 is nearing its exciting climax. It is scheduled to land on the moon on August 23rd. Now that Russia's Luna 25 has crashed, there is great anticipation regarding the Chandrayaan-3. Joining us is Professor Anil Bhardwaj, Distinguished Professor and Director of the Physical Research Laboratory, which is an autonomous unit of the Department of Space. Professor Bhardwaj is closely linked not just with the Chandrayaan-3 mission, but also Chandrayaan-1 and India's Mars Orbiter mission, where he led experiments on all these missions. He was awarded the Infosys Prize for his contributions in the field of planetary science and exploration. Chandrayaan-3 landing on the surface of the moon is extremely important, but this is only the start of the mission. The most important part of the mission starts when the payload is deployed. The payload, in very simple terms, are the instruments that conduct experiments and are set out in the spacecraft. If the object of the mission is to study the specific aspects of the moon, it is Professor Bhardwaj and his team's instruments that will now do that work for the mission. Welcome, Professor Bhardwaj. This is a very exciting time for all of you and all of us. Firstly, tell us why the date of August 23rd is so significant for the mission.
This mission is essentially controlled by the sunlight which is received by the solar panels for powering the whole spacecraft. So we need to look at the region where we get the sunlight for powering, and also it should be visible from the ground, that is from the earth. Okay? And that is why if you look at these two combinations, you find that we should land on 23rd of August when exactly it will be morning, early morning at that landing site, and it will be visible from the earth also. So essentially, because the lunar day is 14 Earth day and our mission is going to last for 14 days, our plan is to land there at early morning of the local time there on the moon and continue to make observations for next 14 days.
If it doesn't land on the 23rd, then what will happen?
If we find that the conditions are not conducive, or there are circumstances which does not allow us to do the landing based on the health of the spacecraft and many other parameters which is continuously being monitored from Mission Control in Bangalore, there are two options. One is to land after 2 days, or go to the alternate landing site which also comes after 2 days. So it is not just the primary landing site where we are targeting for 23rd of August. After 2 days, we will be on the alternate landing site, and that will come after close to 50 hours, where we can do the planned landing as we are planning for the primary landing site. So there are options available for us, but hopefully, since everything is going very well with the spacecraft so far, with all the maneuvers, with all the commands and controls being executed perfectly well, we hope that it will happen on 23rd evening.
What is the most important step that you will be watching out for when the lander makes contact with the lunar surface?
First and foremost, of course, is the safe landing, which we call as soft landing, and or you can say controlled landing of the spacecraft Chandrayaan-3 Vikram. That is the name of the lander. And after that, we will wait for a while for the dust to settle down, which we expect would take half an hour or so. Subsequent to that, based on the continuous observations taken by the lander, we would be commanding the ramp down of the rover. And during this time, we expect that the lander would be providing us images of this rover. Since everything is dependent on the sunlight and the rover solar panels has to be powered with the sunlight, it will take a while. It may take about 3 to 4 hours or maybe more before we will really see that the rover has rolled down onto the lunar surface. And after that only the actual science observations will start.
So what are the key challenges during soft landing on the moon?
Oh, this is it's a very complex mission because first of all, it is totally autonomous. And in addition to being totally autonomous, there are many sensors which is working on board, which is providing the data to the the computer on board, and the computer on board is deciding what action to be taken. Now, imagine a body is moving continuously with a very high speed, providing observations from its sensors to the command control module, which actually drives the whole mission in terms of propulsion, velocity, acceleration, the rate at which the engines will be working or firing, because these are throttable engines. And continuously, you are looking at the region on the lunar surface. And there's no command and control given from the ground. So it is totally autonomous, decided by onboard computer. And that's why it is much more complex than any kind of missions, including, for example, launching, because here there is a boundary, right? So you have to satisfy that boundary and come down gently at the last step. Whereas when you're talking about the rocket launch, we are going up. There's no boundary, right? So there are serious constraints which comes because of this boundary conditions. And therefore, you have to kill the velocity of the spacecraft before it's touched down.
Why is it of interest to us to study the lunar surface, especially in the South Pole, sir?
As you must be aware that Chandrayaan-3 mission, that is the first lunar mission of India, discovered water on the moon. And we know that the amount of water on the moon is much more in the polar regions, or basically as you go towards the pole. Okay. So our idea is to see what is happening around the polar regions. And this region is also important geologically because it's a terrain which has never been observed in situ. And also that there are certain subtle scientific objectives related to the landing site, which is deciding where we should land.
Sir, could you please tell us a little bit about the payloads on the Chandrayaan-3 mission? What is on the lander?
Lander has two experiments. One is alpha particle access spectrometer, or APXS, which is developed in PRL, that is the Physical Research Laboratory where I'm talking to you right now. The other instrument is LIBS, or laser-induced breakdown spectroscopy. And this instrument is developed in LEOS in Bangalore. Both these instruments are sitting in the front of the rover, and they will make observations of the elemental composition, mineralogical composition of the lunar surface to understand the distribution of various elements on the lunar surface and how does they vary within few hundred meters around the landing site where the rover will be traveling or rovering on the lunar surface. On the lander, we have three instruments. One is CHASTE, which is basically a Chandrayaan thermophysical experiment. The second is Rambha LP, which is basically a Langmuir probe. And the third one is ILSA, which is basically a seismometer. Now, this CHASTE is one of its kind of experiment, which is going to provide us temperature distribution in the first 10 centimeter inside the lunar soil. So it is going to be deployed from the lander and getting inserted to a depth of about 10 centimeter. And it will provide the temperatures at every 1 centimeter. The idea behind this observation or this measurement is to know how the heat is actually flowing inside the lunar surface. And what we understand so far is that moon surface is thermally insulated. And therefore, how the heat actually propagates down into the moon from its surface will be measured or conducted by this experiment. It will provide us measurements of not just the temperatures, but there is also a heater sitting at the tip of this probe, which is more like a thermometer going inside the lunar soil. And it will also conduct an experiment to measure the thermal conductivity. The second experiment, which is ILSA, which is basically a seismometer. And our plan is to make measurements of the seismicity of the lunar surface at the landing site. Since we are landing at 70 degrees south, there is no observations from this region, and India will be the first country to do that. We are quite excited to see how seismic activities are captured at that landing site with this seismometer. And we are hopeful that when the rover moves onto lunar surface, also we'll be able to capture signals using this seismometer. In addition to, of course, the moonquakes and meteorite bombardment, which will be happening onto the lunar surface during those 14 days of observations. The third experiment on the lander is a Langmuir probe. And this is basically meant to study the plasma around the landing site at an altitude of 2 meters from the lunar surface. And this would be also the first of its kind of measurements at such high altitude. So all these observations in combined together will be providing us new understanding about the moon, about the landing site. And since we have Chandrayaan-2 orbiter already in orbit, making measurements, and the rover making in situ measurements at those locations where the rover is going to stop and measurements will be made, it will provide us ground truth observations for many of the observations which Chandrayaan-2 orbiter is already making. And so we will combine this in situ measurements from Chandrayaan-3 lander and rover with those which is getting obtained from the Chandrayaan-2 orbiter. And overall, all this will provide us new perspective about the moon at higher latitudes.
Will the lander and the rover communicate with each other, sir?
Yes. A rover will be communicating to the lander and lander will communicate to the ground. But we also have the Chandrayaan-2 orbiter in orbit around the moon. So there is a contingency plan for orbiter also to communicate with the lander. But currently the plan A is that the lander will be directly communicating to the ground in Bengaluru.
So you obviously understand the very complex science involved in this mission, but you also design instruments needed to carry on these experiments. Could you tell us how are these instruments different from what we use on Earth?
The moon temperature variability is very large. If you talk about the equatorial region of the moon, the temperature in the day side is somewhere around 400 Kelvin, or you can say something like 100 degrees centigrade, which is above the boiling point of water, right, on the Earth. And on the night side, the temperature goes down to something like 100 Kelvin, or you can say minus 200 degrees centigrade, or even lower than that. So the variability of the temperature on the moon's surface is about 300 Kelvin. Now, the instruments which is designed should withstand this kind of temperature variabilities if it has to last for continuously 14-day long night. And that's why our plan is to have the observations only for the daytime, because as you come towards the night of the moon at the landing site, there's no sunlight and therefore there's no power protection because the solar panels cannot generate power. And therefore the temperatures will start going down. But we are hopeful in case these electronics survive on the Vikram lander and the Pragyan rover, then probably after 14 days long night, once the sunlight again comes back onto the landing site, we may see some kind of activity which will be really surprising to all of us, because it would be first time that a certain kind of observations being made about the systems and subsystems on the lander surviving at utter cold conditions.
So how long will it take your team to decode the information that is being sent back?
There will be people sitting in the mission control because it's only a 10 days or 14 days mission. So all the teams will be continuously there in the mission control looking at the science data which is coming. Our priority is to see the health of the instruments and the scientific observations which is making. And subsequent to that, we'll be doing a thorough analysis of the scientific data. It will take a couple of months at least for us to bring out new science, because there are many other things which has to be clubbed together along with the science data, the housekeeping parameters, and the location where the rover is moving exactly, And this all will be clubbed together with the Chandrayaan-2 observations, which is also being carried out. So it will take a couple of months for us to bring out the science, but instrument health and the observations are priority during those 14 days.
Lastly, why is Chandrayaan-3 mission important for India, sir?
Chandrayaan-3 mission, you must be already seeing, has galvanized the whole country. Each and every activity is watched by the nation with excitement and anxiety, including us, because we are not worried or there's no fear, but of course there is always an anxiety, right? What is going to happen? And with the confidence which we have, hopefully that will be landing onto the 23rd evening around 6 p.m. The country would be placed among the 4 nations in the world with this landing. There are only 3 nations which have done this so far, which includes USA, USSR, which is Russia now, and China. But India will be the first country to have the landing at the 70 degrees south, which no other lander mission has happened so far. In addition to this, there are many other collateral achievements, or I can say collateral advantages which comes to the country, which are strategic in nature, which are geopolitical in nature, which are important for the nation's students and kids, because they see Indian rover moving onto lunar surface, and on the rover we have ISRO's logo and we have the Ashoka, your thumb, the Ashoka Chakra and the national emblem, which is there onto the rover wheels, and which will be, creating those structures onto the lunar surface, which will galvanize the whole country that India has landed onto the moon. And I certainly believe that this would be a game changer for many Indian children who would be aspiring to not only study science, but take up space science and do exploration within the country.
Thank you, Professor Bhardwaj, for joining us. Here's hoping India's 3rd moon mission will be a grand success. For more updates on Chandrayaan-3 mission, follow Deccan Herald on all social media platforms.